and then another click, until he just couldn't stop clicking because the desire couldn't be fed. Affairs don't start, I suppose, with a secret vacation being taken under the guise of a business trip. It starts with a seemingly innocent glance across a meeting room. It becomes a stare until one day you wake up and you find out it's an obsession. Maybe more closely to home. People don't go through long periods of inactivity from a church generally by just deciding one day to walk away. It happens because one Sunday there's this to do, and then another Sunday down the road there's that to do, and then a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that, until finally you're gone. And God is telling us today, don't be fooled by any of this. It's not just happening in other people's lives. Sin may be crouching. We may not even be noticing it, but it is a giant force in our lives. When we sin, it doesn't just stop there. It's not self-contained. It doesn't go away. It becomes a presence in our lives. First, we go out and do sin, but soon sin comes and does us. And it all kinds of ways that you don't even recognize, it hardens you. You know, do you see the difference already if you've been here the last few weeks and going through this His Story series in this first family? At least when God came to Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3 and they had fallen into sin, they were a bit sheepish about it. They tried to hide. But now here, just a little while later, God comes and confronts Cain. And he's so hurt and so jealous and so angry that he goes out and kills his brother. Sin wasn't dealt with, and it resulted in death. Sin needs to be dealt with. When someone comes to you, for instance, and says, you have cancerous tumors growing in your body, you don't say, I'll get to that sometime. Or you don't go and start yelling at the doctor and getting mad at him because he told you. You say, how can you help me? How can I get better? But when it comes to sin, we kind of brush it off. We kind of ignore it and say, maybe someday I'll take care of that, but not today. And if someone comes and confronts us with it, what's our first reaction? To lash out at them, to be angry with them, to start making claims about them, because we want them to hurt, just like we hurt. It's so easy to just blame someone else. That's how sin is potent. It affects every part of our lives, but the reason why it's able to do that is because it's also so subtle. Do you see it? It's so subtle. It's easy for us to be on guard against things like predators going and abusing children. That's why we're not immune to it, but odds are most of us are not dabbling in that today. And then there's those other things that we can pretty much agree on, that you shouldn't murder someone, or you really shouldn't go around stealing stuff or abusing people. Most people, in spite of the fact that we hear it so much on the news, most people stay away from these things. And it gives them this weird thought that they're good, that somehow they've avoided sin, and certainly that God's okay with them because they're not as bad as those other people. And so they start to wonder, I've defeated sin. It's not a presence in my life. Why do you keep talking about it all the time? And this is where that story about Cain and Abel can really hit home for a lot of us. It's subtle, though, so you got to pay attention. All we're told in this story is that God is pleased with Abel's offering, but he rejects Cain's. And it seems kind of odd because on the outside, we're not giving any evidence that either one of them is entirely different than the other one. All we know is that one is a farmer and one is a rancher. And again, they're both giving offerings to God. Both things were acceptable to give to God. And yet, God likes one and doesn't like the other. And the author of the book of Hebrews tells us why. See, he says that when he's trying to describe people of great faith, he looks back at those people that we should kind of emulate. He uses Abel as an example and says, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain. God wasn't pleased because Abel gave him more. It was because he gave in genuine faith. We're told that God wants us to give from that motivation. And Cain wasn't doing it. Now, Abel gave from that motivation in spite of the fact that thus far, all he had, all Cain had too, was one little verse of the Bible, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where they're given a promise that this sin that's coming to wreak havoc in their lives is going to be taken care of by God. He is going to come and crush Satan and his power in our lives. That was good news to Abel because he saw the power of sin and he knew that he couldn't beat it on his own, and so he looked to God to give it to him. And that led him to respond in real faith and real trust and real thanksgiving. And he gave his best and not his leftovers because of it. In a little while, we're going to have the opportunity, having been given a promise from God, the same promise that Cain and Abel had. We only have the benefit of knowing it even more. And we're going to have the opportunity to give back to God ourselves. And there are only two things really at play when we're making that decision about what to do. There are going to be those of us who are so filled with joy and thanks for what God has done, knowing that nothing else and no one else could do that for us, that we're going to respond with thanks and with faith, and we're going to give Him our best. Now, that's going to look differently for everybody, because we don't all have the same earthly blessings. The key is that we give in faith. So that's one way that God desires us to give, is to give in faith. But the other way, and this is something that probably affects the majority of us, we give not because we've received salvation, but to try to get some form of salvation. It's kind of like how Cain gave, and it's like us giving here today, hoping that we're going to get something out of it, some sort of reward. At the very least, that by giving, we can feel like we've done our part, and that God